All right, and with that, it's my pleasure to introduce our plenary speaker, Tristan Higgins. Tristan E.H. Higgins is a highly trained and internationally recognized speaker, consultant, and coach on diversity, equity, and inclusion. She founded Metaclusive LLC to move corporations and organizations away from a focus on diversity and inclusion to a focus on belonging. She's a vice president of the Lawyers Club San Diego, board member of the American Constitution Society, member of the San Diego County Bar Association Anti-Racism Committee, chair of the California Lawyers Association Diversity Outreach Committee, the lead for the CLA Judicial Diversity Summit planning team, and a member of both the National Association of Women Judges and the International Association of Women Judges. She is also a member of most of the specialty bar associations in San Diego. Tristan has a Bachelor of Arts degree in theater from the University of California, San Diego, and went to California Western School of Law for her Juris Doctor. She began her career as a prosecutor for San Diego County City Attorney and went on to practice entertainment law for the Screen Actors Guild in Los Angeles. After advising SAG-AFTRA and video game contract negotiations, she joined Sega of America in San Francisco, where she oversaw Sega's legal needs for North America. She left Sega to join Sony Electronics in San Diego, where she spent a decade establishing the digital cinema business worldwide and advising the component sales divisions in Silicon Valley, Novi Tel Aviv, and Tokyo on high-tech licensing and sales. Tristan lives with her wife, 2 kids, 1 dog, and 3 cats in San Diego, California. And with that, it's my pleasure to introduce Tristan.
Thank you so much. I think that was Steve. I'm at a loss because I can't see anybody. But thank you for having me. As you heard, I'm Tristan Higgins, and my pronouns are she, her. And I was meant to be there today. I hear some talking. Am I supposed to stop?
No, keep going. Good, keep going.
Okay, great. I was supposed to be there. I was all ready to go. My bags were packed, and I was literally on my way out the door to the airport when I just had this feeling that maybe the sickness that was creeping in last night might be COVID. And sure enough, I got the brightest, pinkest line I've seen since the entire pandemic. And so we just didn't want you all to have to deal with that. And so I'm so pleased that Drew and Sarah and Ann and T and Jody were able to make the pivot. But I'm sorry that you have to listen to somebody on video at 4 o'clock on Friday. So let me do what I can to keep it lively. As you heard, the title today is Lose the Mask, Put on a Cape, Eradicating Implicit Bias. And we are going to talk about 6 things. They're here, but I'm going to go quickly. So we're going to talk about psychological safety. We're going to do a little bit of, most of our work will be on defining bias, a little bit on classifying bias. You'll see that that's really not that important. We're going to talk about superheroes because I understand and I can't believe I can't see the room full of superheroes with capes on, and it's unbelievable. And we'll talk a little bit about what bias costs us in the workplace. And then we may not be able to spend very much time on interrupting bias, but you will have this deck, and there are lots of concrete suggestions in there. So we'll get to what we can. You already heard my bio, so I'm not going to spend any time on that. This is supposed to be me, this picture here, because you may have guessed I am gender nonconforming, and so I sometimes identify in a female way and kind of sometimes in a male way, but it just depends. Can I lose the mask now? Does that sound all right with everybody?
Yes. Great.
All right, thank you. If I was there in person, I'd be wearing a beautiful Dr. Strange cape, but I can't really wear it sitting down. So let me just tell you a tiny bit about myself. That's my wife in the upper left-hand corner. She's Scottish, which tells me a lot about diversity because she sees Americans quite differently than I do. In the middle, that's my 2 children. My eldest, I need to tell you that my children, they're there. I have my eldest child is non-binary and uses they, them pronouns. My youngest identifies he, him. I'm going to skip a few things because we need to make up some time. In the bottom right-hand corner is a very unflattering picture of me, and I include that and talk about it at the start of presentations because I always want people to remember that not all of the things that make us different are visible. I have significant disabilities. I have had 25 surgeries to date, and I'm waiting a 26th. And if you saw me on the street on most days, you would not know that. And that's really, really important, because what happens a lot in this discussion is our friends who you're all thinking of right now, our straight white male friends, feel excluded from the discussion. And sometimes people are quick to snap judgments, and that's a real mistake, because you don't know who you're talking to behind the face, right? You don't know what their family's like, you don't know who their friends are, you don't know if they have dyslexia or a stutter or something else. And so I just want to encourage you to start to think more broadly. Metaclusive means a sense of belonging that transcends diversity and inclusion, where all are represented, valued, and accepted. I came up with this word mostly because a mentor told me to make up my own word, which was a good idea, and then I trademarked it. And it means if you've been looking for me, you will find me on Google without me paying them. But the idea was that a lot of companies, a lot of firms, probably some of you there, have spent a lot of money and time on this issue and don't feel a lot of change. And those in the profession who have come before me decided that we should really start focusing on belonging, and I totally agree with that. Right, I was going to spend some time on this, but we're going to skip this for now. Just know I'm not calling on anyone, obviously, because I can't see you. And if someone asks a question that is slightly awkward, please give them grace, because everybody is learning. Okay, so defining bias. So unconscious bias is the thumbprint of the culture on our brain. That's Dr. Mahzarin Banaji from Harvard. She's pretty much the founding mother of this science, this thinking. And when we have longer classes, we watch some of her videos, things like that. And if you're really interested in this, you can certainly do that afterwards on YouTube. You can find some great videos from her. What does that mean? An implicit stereotype or bias is the unconscious attribution of particular qualities to a member of a certain social group. Implicit stereotypes are influenced by experience and are based on learned associations between various qualities and social categories, including race or gender. In other words, implicit stereotypes that we experience here in America are different than some of the implicit stereotypes that our friends in the UK have, or our friends in the Middle East, or people in Africa. Culture has a lot to do with this. What's the difference between explicit and implicit? We have a whole room full of attorneys, you all know this. Explicit is direct or clearly expressed, laid out in full. I have a direct preference for Diet Coke over Pepsi. Implied, unstated, or expressed indirectly is implicit. It's not based in fact, with no qualification or question. It's based on what our brain believes to be true. Now, once you know or should know about your bias, it's conscious bias, right? It's no longer unconscious bias. So that means you're all going to have a pretty good idea, and if that doesn't sound good to you, you should leave, if you don't want the MCA credit. All right, just a very little bit on the science. Our brain sorts billions of data in the amygdala stimuli, something like 11 million pieces of data coming in every minute, and we can only grasp 40 at a time. So our brain takes this data, we layer on our own experiences, and it's really important to understand that not all bias is bad, right? I mean, bias served our species for many, many years to keep us from eating the wrong mushroom, to keep us from petting the tiger, we made these decisions a long time ago, and it was very, very helpful. What we tend to do when we're talking about bias is we group things into two categories. We have safe and familiar, which is in the green comic pane there, and then we have dangerous. And when you're dealing with foraging in the forest or survival, that is very helpful. That is something that we have and we do not wish to change. The problem is when we use those instincts and self-protection, the things that protected us from a tiger, we use them to make hiring decisions, or when we use them to decide who gets a raise or a promotion. And this happens because we're not aware. So instead of just sorting things into safe and familiar and dangerous, you start sorting things into good and bad. And that looks like this. If you are a zebra, or as my wife would say, zebra, in the upper left corner there, the green, you believe that zebras are safe. And think about it, right? When you look out at the zoo, all the zebras are together. If you look on any of those documentaries, the antelope doesn't hang out with the zebras, right? Sort of have this ingrained bias to stay with things that are just like us. Now, the fact that it's natural doesn't mean it's good, right? But it's there. Now, in this example, I want you to imagine dinosaurs are dangerous, right? I mean, you don't have to imagine, but you do have to imagine dinosaurs and zebras at the same time, because I know they weren't around together, but dinosaurs are much cooler than if I just put up like a tiger. So the way this breaks down is, instead of talking about a zebra, let's talk about for men and women, for example. So if you are a man, you're going to believe at a subconscious level this implicit bias that all men are safe. And that translates to a male being safe and good, right, on the chart we had before. And then everyone who is not male is unsafe. If you are not male, you're unsafe or bad. That's the process that our amygdala is doing if we're not aware. So then if you're talking about someone else who is not male, they are unsafe and bad. So instead of sorting between zebra and T-Rex, we end up sorting, in this example, a man thinking that women are not bad, are bad at an implicit, unconscious level. In other words, I'm not thinking any of you guys are sitting there thinking, oh, women are bad. That's not what's happening here. It's unconscious things going on. Having some trouble advancing. Here we go. So it should look like this. We should have the dangerous predator, and we label the dangerous predator as unsafe, and then we sort all the rest of things in life as safe if they are not a dangerous predator, right? So you've got your zebra there, you've got your superhero panda, this cute little kitty, and this pink pony. What ends up happening if we're not aware of our biases and we don't try to interrupt them is that it looks more like this. So the zebra is on the left by itself, safe, because we see the world as black and white rather than safe or not safe. So it's zebra, and then everything else not zebra. I hope you're with me. I can't see, so I have no idea if I've got nods or if I've got confused looks. It shouldn't be that the little kitty and the superhero panda and the pink pony are lumped together with the T-Rex. All right, so let's talk about some definitions other than unconscious bias. Diversity. Here's one of my superhero slides. You're going to get quite a few of these. And diversity is, I like to give the example that all of these heroes who are the Avengers, if you're a DC fan, don't worry, I've got you both. All of these superheroes have different powers. Some of them are similar, of course, right? Multiple heroes have strength, but they don't all have the same power. And that is a good thing. If you have a law firm filled with people who are diverse, who feel like they belong, my argument is that that is like having a league of superheroes. And who wouldn't want to work with a league of superheroes? And for your DC fans, I promise, here's your DC heroes. So when you have on the Avengers or the Justice League, either team, you have a variety of superpowers. For example, and that's a really good thing. So if you have an incident at sea, Superman might be able to help you, but you probably need Aquaman. And if you have something going on in the air, Aquaman is not as useful. Now, if you've seen the movies, he can be thrown by somebody, but if you've got something in the air, it's better for you to have a superhero who flies. That's the example I'm trying to use here for you, that somebody who uses the assistance of a wheelchair, somebody who identifies as gender nonconforming, people of different faiths, people of different veteran statuses, all of those people working together is like having that team of superheroes. When we talk about inclusion, we're talking about everybody feeling like they can work together. So diversity is just people who are different, and inclusion, and if we had the inclusion slide up, you'd see I forced DC and Marvel together, which sometimes gives people fits, and saying that both of those teams, which would only happen if Disney bought DC, pardon me. So that is inclusion. And then when we want to talk about belonging, right? Belonging is easy. Everybody understands what it means to belong. We understand this from birth. You understand, if nothing else, you understand what it feels like to not belong. And what I like to try to educate people on is the fact that not belonging is the default. So those of you who are there in the room, you walked into the conference this morning. If you didn't walk in with someone, what's the first thing that you were probably thinking of? Finding someone that you knew, someone who could help you feel that sense of belonging, even though it wasn't conscious, perhaps. Sometimes you walk into a cocktail party, those of you that are going to go to this spectacular reception after this, you're going to look for somebody you know, right? We understand belonging. Okay, so what we
Keep
like to
going.
say, my line of work is that belonging is a sense of fitting in, feeling like you are an important member of a group. Just not just at the in the room, but that you are at the table.
It's a separate.
And of course, I love the Ginsburg quote: "Women belong in all places where decisions are being made."
You can't show both.
I want to talk about the difference between equality versus equity, but this is very visual.
You can either
Here, maybe I could shift.
because there's no way to share it.
All right, let me talk about bias. We're going to go out of order, okay?
You're not able to see the tab.
There are many, many types of unconscious bias. But really, if your decision-making and actions are being impacted by factors that you aren't aware of, does it matter which kind of bias it is? My argument is that it does not. And we have, we can do lots of extra study on bias, but I always like to share a couple of funny ones. We have handshake bias. This means that candidates with better handshake scores are considered more hireable. Meaning decisions are made in the first few minutes, not the first few hours. That's a nonverbal bias. How about low voices? People with lower voices managed larger teams and made more money. A Canadian study in 2009 showed that people prefer political candidates with lower voices. I think some of these things also relate to gender, right? Because we tend to assign authority to male. And so anybody who is trying to be an authority is going to be better perceived if they fit that bias. Now, there's one that's always fun to talk about, which is that the salaries of blonde women are 7% higher than those of women who are brunettes or redheads. That's a study out of Australia. So, you know, maybe you want to, before you ask for a raise, you want to dye your hair blonde. All right, I need to spend a little time talking about the difference between equity and equality. A lot of people, I go back to the better camera since it's not making a difference. Hold on just one second. A lot of people have said to me, as I have said, I treat everyone equally. And while that is a good thing, I'd like to encourage you to think about treating everyone equitably instead of equally. And let me establish the distinction. So I want you to imagine 3 people on the sidewalk. Each of these 3 people has a ladder in their hands, leaning up against a building. And at the top of that ladder is a star, something that they would like to get to. All 3 of our friends are standing on the same cement, they have the same ladder, and they're going for the same goal. That is equality. We have the same starting point, same starting time, same abilities. All of our friends look like they can climb that ladder, same resources, same goals. But that's not what we have in our society. What we have in our society, instead of 3 friends standing next, or strangers standing next to each other on the sidewalk, is we have a street that's uneven. And we have one friend whose ladder is several steps higher than everyone else's. It's almost like half the space for them to get to the stars. We have another friend who has a similar a leg up, 2 steps up, but they still have a big ladder. Then we have somebody who's starting from a hole in the street. It's actually like a manhole or whatever you call it. It's gender neutral, I don't know. And our friend is trying to climb out of that hole with the same ladder and the same stop on top of the building. And then finally, we have somebody with a ladder that's sort of dangling over their head, and they are using the assistance of a wheelchair. This is what inequality looks like. We have 4 different people with different starting points, different abilities, different resources, but still the same goal. They are all trying to get to the star. This is inequality. And this is built into our system here in America by this is what we call systemic racism and bias. The steps that I am trying to ask you to imagine, or maybe to read later, have been built. The hole, the manhole, that was intentionally built, and the ladder was placed too high. Now, it wasn't done by any of us, but it was done. Now, the picture gets even more complicated when you add in things like redlining credit. I'm a room full of lawyers, I would imagine you have a good understanding of that. That's where we literally took a map many years ago and would redline out the zip codes that banks weren't going to rent to, or weren't going to deal with. This is still happening today. Today, it still happens. We have violence against minorities, difference in educational deficits. It's the way our schools are funded, at least in California. They're funded with property taxes. So kids that live in richer areas are going to have better schools, even though the kids didn't do anything to deserve that. Or in the opposite, the kids who live in poor areas didn't do anything to deserve that either. We have higher standards that we hold our minorities to, and we have interaction with law enforcement. All of these things further complicate that picture. Really just taking rungs off the ladder, breaking it in half. Now it's like a spinning video game. Let me use my Wonder Woman cup. Yeah. So diversity, which we talked about at the very beginning with the superheroes, is great. But all diversity does by itself is bring more people into an otherwise complicated system that haven't done anything to affect what's happening. So in your mind, you're thinking about those ladders, about our friend who's in the manhole trying to climb out of that broken ladder. Now there's a crowd of people, similar to him or them, standing around them. And then our wheelchair, our friend who's using the assistance of a wheelchair has another friend with them. That's what diversity looks like. We haven't done anything to fix the fact that some people are starting on higher steps with less distance to travel. We haven't done anything to patch the ground or to fix the ladder. So that's where equity comes in. Equity redirects resources to fix barriers and intentionally support those who need it to achieve equality. I'll give you a simple example. A law firm decides they don't have enough women in management and leadership, and so they develop a mentorship program that is for women. That is equity, right? Would the men perhaps like to experience that mentorship program? Yeah, they probably would. Some firms would allow them to as well. But the women might need that program in order to advance. So what equity looks like when we have our slides is, back to our ladders and our friends, is we hire a bucket truck, one of these construction things, to come in and fix the ladder for our friend, patch the ground underneath them, install an elevator for our friends, the last friends who are using a wheelchair and a cane. That is the intentional redirection of resources to fix barriers. Now, we have this concept of birth lottery, and I don't think I've ever given any kind of presentation like this when somebody didn't think or say, it's not my fault I'm privileged. And I say to them, 100%, you're right. It is not. And I'll use myself. I have a lot of privilege. And it's not my fault that I was born with the privilege that I have. What I want you to try to remember and try to think about is that it's not my fault that I am privileged. It's not somebody else's fault that they are not. We spend a lot of time, those of us that are privileged, those of us that are well educated, those of us that have jobs, those of us that have our own car and our own place to live, thinking that other people just need to try harder, or they need to get a second job, or their family needs to prioritize education more. What we don't do is empathize and think they started with a lot less resources at a different time and less support than I did. So when you get your slides later, you're going to have, there's one slide, it's very pretty, trust me, it's beautiful. Prettiest slide you've ever seen, that has a list of privileges on it. And when I'm in person with folks, I never ask for people to raise their hand, but I do like to run through the privileges that are here because a lot of them are things we don't think about, right? When I started talking about this, I wonder if anybody there thought, well, I'm not a trust fund kid. That's what I used to think. But what kinds of privileges are there? So being white in our society is a privilege. I got that one. Being male, I do not have that one. Cisgender. Now, cisgender, we don't have time to go through today, but that just means that you are comfortable with the gender you were assigned at birth. So it's not trans, it's cis. I am cisgender. I am not heterosexual, right? Orientation, whether you are gay or straight, although there's lots more choices than that. Religion, in our society, we privilege Christianity. Your socioeconomic status. So here, if you are middle class or better, you have some significant privileges. If you are able-bodied, if you're not using a wheelchair, if you don't have a cane, if you don't have dyslexia, you don't have neurodivergence, you are experiencing a great deal of privilege in our society. If you speak English as a first language, that is a privilege. Again, there's nothing wrong with being proud of your skills, but it's important to remember that all of these things are privileges that are working on our behalf every day, whether we think about it or not. In America, it certainly is a privilege to be an American citizen. And this is a good one to point out that these privileges aren't bad or good, right? For example, there's lots of jobs in America that you cannot have if you are not a citizen. I know because my wife experienced that. That is probably appropriate, at least in the stuff she was looking at. But it's still privilege. It's still privilege to remember. We're not assigning good or bad to all of these different characteristics, right? It's very neither good nor bad to be male. But what I'm saying here is that that is privileged in our society. If you are tall versus short, that's privileged. If you are thin versus overweight or fat, I try to use that word. It's not a bad word, apparently, even though I don't love it. And if you have the support of your family, that is a tremendous privilege. You graduated from high school and then graduated from college. Each one of those is another level of privilege. Again, nobody gave you anything. We're not saying that. What we're saying is there is nothing wrong with admitting the privileges that I have that helped me get where I am. I was always expected to go to college, always. And even though I didn't have my parents' support to do that, I had their expectations. That is a form of privilege. I am very educated, as many of you are, or all of you are, and I've always had food and housing stability. So if you could see it, maybe you can see it in your mind's eye. It's a nice little checklist. And for me, even for me, a gender non-conforming lesbian, disabled atheist, I still have more privileges than not on this list. And why does that matter? Well, it matters because the more privilege that you have, the harder it is to see bias, because the world is interacting with you in a privileged way. So you are not experiencing the things that your friends and colleagues and strangers are experiencing. Simple example. Years ago, a friend of mine told me that she was being followed around in a retail shop, I don't remember what shop it was, but she was being followed around, and my friend is Black. And I said something like, that's ridiculous. Nobody would follow you around. Look at how nice you look. You clearly look educated. Well, that was a mistake, because I couldn't imagine that she would get followed around because she's my peer, and I never get followed around. And I'm hoping that is kind of making sense to you all. All right, so we're going to move on now. We're going to talk about everybody has this. Yes? Okay, all right. I hope you're all still with me.
We are.
Right. Okay, so what I want to do now is talk a little bit about superpowers. And of course, it's a tie-in, right? Like that's how I founded my whole business, so I could talk about superheroes all day, which was really pretty clever, I suppose. Everyone has a superpower, and it's important to figure out what yours is. Now, In my argument, I'm suggesting that being black is a superpower. Now, I know that my friends there in the room who are black will argue with me that it doesn't feel like that, and I appreciate that 100%. Actually, I probably don't appreciate it, right, because it's not my experience. But what I want people in authority to realize is that having a team around you that is different is very, very powerful. It's good to realize what is your superpower. For me, I have 3 that I have identified over the years. A couple being told by other people, and then some figuring out myself. One of my superpowers is making people feel like they belong. And hopefully, even though I'm here on this tiny screen, you feel like you belong in this room, even though I can't see you. Another superpower is humor. I talk about very difficult things, and I try to use humor. And vulnerability. I will always admit when I'm wrong in a presentation or when I'm doing this work, maybe not as much with my wife, but I definitely do it professionally. So what does that look like? Well, how do I use my superpowers to help others? Because what I want to do is move through the world sort of creating an aura of belonging, right? Like if you imagine a force field around me, I don't know, maybe 50 feet. I would like anyone who comes within 50 feet of me to feel like they belong. And how do I do that? Well, I am always myself. I show up with my mohawk. I have my bow ties. I'm a goofball. I started the presentation trying to show you a picture of me in a Star Wars costume at Disneyland. I'm a goof, but I'm also educated and trained on these subjects, so it's important to be myself. Another thing that really relates to a superpower is having genuine interest in what people say, think, feel, and do. In other words, people know if you are just listening to respond, they know if you are not listening, and they know if you are actually listening. And my suggestion to you is that listening to the people that you are talking with and working with is basically a superpower. People don't do it very often. It's important to truly see people and value them as they are. I don't say things like I'm colorblind, or I don't see gender, or I don't care if somebody's in a wheelchair. No, what I want to be able to say is, I see you, Fred. I see that you are using the assistance of a wheelchair, and I can imagine that you have some struggles I do not understand. Now, I actually have been in a wheelchair, so that's a bad example, but multiple times. But the idea is to see people for what they are. I don't want you to not see that I'm gender nonconforming, because that erases a whole lot of my experience. And those are things I can add to the table and bring, to the team. Another way that I like to try to use my superpowers is to use humor appropriately. A lot of people want to use humor whenever they get uncomfortable. That's a bad idea, I would suggest. Because what I think is funny is not what everyone else thinks is funny. This is especially true if you're a hiring partner or a manager in an office. Humor gets a lot of people in trouble. Your employment defense attorneys in the room are probably nodding. I am, what's a fifth, you can't see it, but a fifth way that I use my superpowers is I am very open to people who are different than me. If I am at an event, or I am at a lunch, or I am somewhere in a meeting, and someone lets on that they are very different than me in some way. For example, I was recently at a CLA meeting, the conference here, and I sat next to a woman who had great faith and is very spiritual. And I realized that as we were talking to each other, and I didn't shy away thinking, oh, she's going to judge me for being an atheist. Now, certainly sometimes that might happen, but I take those opportunities to try to connect with people. I really do believe that's the only way we're going to make it going forward, is if Republicans, Democrats, the Jedi Party, which is what they have in Scotland, isn't that cool, can talk to each other, right? I don't need to change your mind. I'm just trying to have coffee. So being willing to be vulnerable and share myself, it's very much like being myself. I'd like you to use pronouns correctly. Do a whole separate education on that. But the bottom line is, if people tell you what they are, use them. It's very hurtful if you don't. And if you want to try to use this sort of like the extra superhero power is to use gender inclusive language. When you get the deck later, you'll see some examples of gender inclusive language. Things like replacing what we all still say, hey guys, with hey folks, or hello attorneys, or hello members of the Contra Costa County Bar. A lot of people have already started replacing ladies and gentlemen, or men and women, with friends, folks, members of the jury. Now, I am not telling you that you may not say these things. That is not what is happening. But I want you to realize, be aware that you may use that phrase thinking you are being very polite and appropriate in the situation, which you are. And someone in the room who is like me, or like my eldest child, defend it because they feel excluded. And I'm a firm believer that if you're going to offend someone, it should be on purpose. Don't want it to be an accident, right? So if I want to offend the room, I want to do it intentionally. I don't want to do it because I said ladies and gentlemen to a room full, there's quite a few trans folks. So you will see some of these examples. I'll leave that for you. And I'm going to move on now. How am I doing that time? Yep. Okay, I'm going to move on to some of the results of bias. So if you're not convinced that bias is dangerous, let's talk a little bit about how it's affecting your firms. What does it look like? Well, good people get passed up for positions, assignments, and teams. Passed up equals hurt feelings and feeling excluded. Excluded employees are less productive. Statistically, we know this. It has been documented. Excluded employees are less productive. When employees are less productive, other employees must work harder, right? You don't get to pay them less. They're still there, but they're being less productive. And eventually, unhappy employees leave, or maybe they sue. And where do they go when they leave? They go to your competitors with all that good knowledge that you taught them. And of course, this room knows that litigation is incredibly expensive, so we want to try to avoid it. What are some of the costs of bias? Well, I hinted at a second ago, excluded employees have a 50% higher turnover rate than employees who do not feel excluded. If you were to have a company of 10,000 employees, that would result in $10 million a year in lost revenue. 10,000 employees, so a UCSD, Davis, one of the energy companies, right? Some of the biggies, they're losing $10 million a year if their employees feel excluded. Employees who perceive bias are 31% more likely planning to leave within a year, versus only 10% of employees who do not perceive bias. Now, attorneys notice, I'm not saying employees who are discriminated against. I'm saying employees who perceive bias. Right? Bias is in the eye of the beholder. And if they are perceiving it, they're 31% more likely to leave. Employees who feel exclusion take 75% more sick days, and they have a 56% increase in their job performance. Now, that's kind of the worst case scenario, right? You've got people taking lots of sick days, and then when they are there, they are decreasing their job performance. But until you put them on an improvement plan, you can't get rid of them. So they haven't quit. They're taking up space in your organization, taking up valuable resources, but they're not working at even 3/4 of their percentage of their value and their energy. Employees who perceive bias are 3 times more likely to be disengaged at work. So employees who perceive bias, 3 times more likely to be disengaged in the office. Now, Gallup says, this is not like numbers according to Tristan, Gallup says that active disengagement at work costs between $450 and $550 billion a year. That's a staggering amount of money that we might be losing just because we think this stuff maybe is touchy-feely, we don't want to spend time on it, and that stuff belongs outside the workplace. I want to encourage you that it doesn't. It belongs in the workplace. How about this? Employees who perceive bias are 2.6 times more likely to withhold ideas and market solutions from you. So 34% versus 13% in the past 6 months. So if you have employees who perceive bias, they are withholding ideas and market solutions recently. All right. 1% of the nation's Fortune 500 CEOs are Black. 4% are women, and only 1 is openly gay, right? So 500 CEOs, 1% is Black. There's a mathematician that will tell you what that is. I don't know off the top of my head. 4% are women, which is way less than the 50% so that it could be. And 10% of our population, I believe, is Black, roughly. And only 1 Fortune 500 CEO is openly gay. Now, I don't think it takes a lot to realize there's some bias there, right? And how about this one? As many as 50% of the women who are working in science, engineering, and technology will leave because of a hostile work environment. Now, even if all of you work in law firms, it's really an important statistic to understand, right? As many as half of your women employees are likely to leave if they experience a hostile work environment. And hostile work environment, that's a magic word, right? That's a lawsuit word. All right. So what are some of the common ways that this bias shows up at work? Who gets hired? How pay is assigned and increased? Bonuses. Who gets the bonuses? Who gets promoted? Special assignments, training opportunities. Who's interrupted in meetings? We know that women are interrupted in meetings significantly more often than men. And we know that Black women and brown women are much more likely to be interrupted than their white women counterparts. There's a lot of problems with that. That's something that you can stop. If you see someone get interrupted, you can say, I'm sorry, Julie, did you want to say something? You can step in right there and help. Client time and opportunities. Right? The people who are closest to the power tend to get those opportunities. And we know that minorities are being excluded from that because of the CEO statistics. Inclusion or exclusion of employees. Macroaggressions. I call them macroaggressions instead of microaggressions because my friends who have talked about these in the race category who have experienced these, they don't feel like microaggressions. They feel like constant attacks. And yet those of us who are doing them, we don't realize it. All right, we're about, I don't know what time we actually started, but I do know it's Friday afternoon and you all are trying to get your drinks. So let me just spend a couple of minutes, maybe 2 or 3 minutes on interrupting bias. Does that sound okay, Sarah?
Yep, all good.
So I have 5 kind of key things that I like to talk about with how to interrupt bias on a big picture. The number 1 thing is to acknowledge that you have bias. If you say to me when we're talking one-on-one, I don't have bias, then the conversation is over. There's nothing else I can do. I mean, I can try to show you the numbers, but you will believe that you don't have those biases. And yet, scientifically, it seems pretty clear to me that we all have bias, which again, is not inherently bad. That's the beginning of the talk. So number 1, acknowledge that you have bias. Number 2, talk about bias. Normalize it. Have somebody in the office point out to you, somebody that you like, let's just go there, don't, gonna, ask the boss or somebody that maybe you have a little strife with, to tell you, hey, you interrupted Julie in that meeting. Did you realize that? Okay, so talk about bias, normalize it. Agree that having bias is not acting on bias. Just like having thoughts is not acting on the thoughts, right? Having bias is not the same thing as acting on it. I have bias, I have lots of bias, but I am trying really hard not to act on it. Encourage friends and colleagues to point things out to you, and that's part of that discussion, normalizing it. And then I want to encourage you to adopt some bias interruption techniques in your hiring practices and in your day-to-day practices. The cool thing about this is it's not something I created. You can Google bias interruption techniques, and you can come up with quite a few that you can use. I'll just talk about a couple of them. In hiring, you want to insist on a diverse pool of candidates. You can't pick a candidate if they're not in the pool. Vet job descriptions for gender norming. If you're looking for an aggressive go-getter, women are less likely to apply. If you're looking for a team player, women are more likely to apply. And you might not have realized that, because that might not be the message you mean to send. Think about accepting equivalent work experience instead of a degree, because we know that education is a significant source of inequity. Redact your resumes. Have somebody who's not involved in the process do the redacting for you. When you get further down the line, you can look at those things, but what we're trying to do is keep you from keeping a black candidate out of the pool because of your unconscious bias. There was a study, I'm sure some of you know about, where the exact same resume was sent to a bunch of different law firm hiring partners. And they put a white sounding name on one resume and a black sounding name on the other resume. Notice I don't say black name or white name because there are no such thing. But they asked them to rate the candidates. And the resumes were identical. But consistently, 80% of those people were more likely to call the white sounding name resume in for an interview than the black sounding name resume. And I don't even think it's much of a stretch to say that none of those people would have admitted that that was what they were thinking. And so it's important, if that's happening, if that might be happening underneath the surface, let's find some ways to stop it. Redacting names, redacting colleges, redacting some of the activities at the very beginning is a good idea. All right. I'm suggesting that you be known for inclusion. As a firm, as an organization, if you're in-house, recruit where you are lacking. So if you don't have enough Black employees, you don't have enough LGBTQ plus employees, you want to go to job fairs that are specifically designed for finding students in that demographic. Another way that you can be known for inclusion is to support professional organizations. There are many organizations in your area that support minority bar associations, et cetera. Panel interviews are better than one-on-one interviews at the beginning. Having consistent questions are better. Yes, I know you will feel handcuffed. That's on purpose. They're trying to keep your bias from creeping in. You want to audit the process and make sure that what you are doing, what you have adopted, is making a difference. Here's a couple things for the day-to-day, and then we're going to wrap up, and you'll get to look at the rest of them when you get the deck. But in your day-to-day running of your office, and that sphere, that 50-foot sphere that I'm walking around in, if I'm in the office, I want to set up a rotation for office housework. Now, what does this look like? I'm in a meeting, we have our staff meeting, everybody's there, somebody brought bagels, everybody leaves, and it's going to be the women who are going to stay behind and clean that up. Not every woman, but it's much more likely that a woman is going to volunteer to do that. How many times have you been in a meeting and somebody has asked a woman to take the notes, or a woman has volunteered to take the notes? For whatever reason, we have a stereotypical tendency to believe those jobs are ours. One way you can fight that is by setting up a rotation. Attorney A is going to do the cleanup this week, attorney B is going to do it next week, et cetera. Value DEIB, diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging in your work. Have mentorship programs, have coaching programs, have sponsorship programs. It's really important. If you can, include it on your performance reviews. The companies that I see that are super committed to this are actually tying fiscal reward with people's ability to keep their teams and make their teams more diverse to meet their goals. Evaluate your team dynamics and interpersonal communication. We already talked about this. Who gets interrupted in meetings? Where do people sit in a meeting? Who eats lunch together? If you've ever walked into a meeting and experienced what I have, you walk into a meeting and a whole bunch of women are sitting around the edge of the wall, and the men are all sitting at the table. This is also true for white versus black, for any environment that you want to pick a minority. For some reason, we feel the need to exclude ourselves. If that was to happen in your next staff meeting, take a moment, you're the person in charge, you got the big shoulders, and say, I'd like to ask everyone to come to the table. You're setting an expectation that everyone has a place there. Of course, mansplaining or explaining, straight-splaining, I'm not sure exactly which, that seems a very negative term to me, but it's important to not explain things to other people about their experience that they actually know better. Let's talk about it that way. And it's really important to solicit input from your entire team. We don't often talk about the fact that introverts are also diverse population. In our society, we really preference and privilege extroverts, but your introverts and your shy people have fantastic ideas, and they're not going to give them in the same way that I will if I'm sitting in your meeting. Okay, so with that, I'm going to wrap up. I really wish I could have shared more visual with you, but we'll get to do it another time, I suppose. And I just want to encourage you that by creating space where people feel like heroes, you're going to save your organization money, you're going to increase innovation, and you're going to improve profitability. And I think that makes you a superhero, which means all of you can get rid of the mask, which is no good. We don't like masks. Secret identities are bad. I want you to be yourself with the cape on. So thank you very, very much for letting me present to you.